The last panel yesterday was panel B, Coordinating Peacebuilding and Trauma Work. Katie Mansfield started us off by introducing the experiential educational program, if I may call it that, of Eastern Mennonite University's Center for Justice and Peacebuilding. That's called STAR. We were introduced to it yesterday also by, I believe, by Nancy and Amala. STAR stands for Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience, which has been used by thousands of participants all over the world, and whose books have been contextualized to many different settings, including South Sudan, or youth, and I'm assuming that's US American youth, perhaps? Generally. Okay. Generally, for youth. And has also been translated into at least Swahili, if no other languages. At least Swahili.
But the translations are in more than 6 languages.
Okay.
But the youth star is only in English.
Okay, gotcha. There were a bunch of different books. I just picked out a couple that I remembered. Books meaning curriculums. And I'm not going to tell you all about STAR, but I recommend very highly that you look into it. I'm sure there's a website and there's materials up there. Good. After Katie, Barry Hart followed with a discussion of how to include psychosocial trauma approaches within peacebuilding efforts. He presented a revised model from the standard clinical model, or maybe it's not standard, but from a clinical model used for those who suffer from PTSD. This revised model was one that can be used for whole societies of people who have experienced great suffering and included a lot of extra contextual components. Lastly, Frederica Bubenzer and Marian Tankik pointed to a disconnect between peacebuilding and mental health, similarly to Barry Hart, and presented to us a recent report from their work together that also is trying to integrate post-conflict social transformation programs and psychosocial approaches, emphasizing necessary contextuality to both, local resources, and many other points of emphasis. You can see their report, if it interests you, called Healing Communities, Restoring Societies, Exploring the Interconnectedness Between Psychosocial Needs, Practice, and Peacebuilding. That was our academic, or not only academic, but our major content yesterday. Then some people went to visit the Historical Museum, and some others of us met to do a bit of action planning, and I hope to present, I'll discuss with Zilka, but perhaps a bit of that at the closing today. So why don't we close our review of yesterday and move into our keynote speech with Steve Olweean, who is here next to me. And let me find that. So the topic of the keynote, the second healing keynote, is Healing Trauma When Society is the Victim. And Steve is founding director of the Common Bond, or of Common Bond Institute, the founding president of the International Humanistic Psychology Association, a past president of the Association for Humanistic Psychology, and a recipient of various awards. He has 35 or plus years of experience in community-based mental health treatment to high-risk populations, and has held positions as clinical director and clinical supervisor, worked in outpatient, residential, day treatment, outreach, crisis intervention, and private practice settings, and has functioned as a consultant and field supervisor for various different groups and people.
You don't need to read.
Okay, I'll stop reading. He'll tell us about what he does, I hope. And I hand.
Shy, I'll tell you.
Good, great.
So, just a little bit about this morning is that just as I was getting ready to prepare for flying out from Michigan to come here, Julianne mentioned that David, right? Was not able to come.
This today?
Yeah, the other person.
No, it's
Oh, I have.
Atak Ayaz, I think.
No, the other person who was going to share the.
Yes.
Yeah, so we were going to.
Yes.
We were going to be sharing this time period, and we were to speak about 10 minutes each.
I said, right, you got an hour.
And then just have question, answer, and discussion. And then prior to my leaving, I learned that there's an hour to fill. So, and I've been in the middle of this crazy process of trying to prepare a very complicated proposal with Michigan State University and NIH, and literally up until the time I had to rush out to the airport I was working on. So I don't have a PowerPoint, but actually I'm glad that I'm at this point in the conference because there's a lot that I've been really privy to and really grateful to hear and find out about for all the information and gifts here that people have to sort of input into the whole gathering. And so I also changed what I was going to say based on that. This is the result of it. And what this is a, by the way, what I want to do just to give you an idea of the structure of the time here is one, to share some perspectives really and information, and then what I'd like to do really, and I think I still have your permission for this, is to maybe use some of the time for processing not just what I'm talking about, but the conference experience for yourself. So we're all together one time. I think this is the last time we're all together like this. So it's a good opportunity to say something or share something or ask something that you might not have had an opportunity to do up until now. Originally, what I was going to be doing was focusing more exclusively on talking about the similarities and differences between individual and communal experiences of trauma, and individual and communal experiences of belief systems, how they're formed, how they're developed, how they're sustained, both positive and negative belief systems. And that reminded me that a number of years ago at a clinic that I was the director of, we put together a concept, and this was in our mental health practice, that just helped us get a handle on working with who had very deep-seated and negative. And I'm sure the therapists here have dealt with folks who are so embedded with that and so invested in that as a protection system that trying to get through that beyond even the cognitive, get through to the point where the person feels a real shift, because beliefs really are not thoughts. You know, I can look at a movie about swimming, and if I've never swam before, I can spend hours and hours watching progressive practice of swimming and say, I got it. You know, I know how this works. But then if I walk to the end of a pier that's like 60 feet deep, and someone says, well, you learned how to swim, why don't you just jump in? Well, what happens is it can feel like a wall. It can feel like I can't even move 1 inch toward the water because my belief says you've never swam before, you're going to drown. That's much more powerful than anything I can develop on a cognitive level. And so that's, in therapy, that's one of the biggest challenges, is to, in one sense, honor the belief system because it's there for a reason. Nobody comes up with even what seems to be a very destructive belief system internally without good cause. And so the first step is honoring that and believing, even if, thinking and believing, even if I can't see what the causation is, to know that there is a causation and it's a very important one. And before someone is willing to shift even a little bit, they have to feel that there is a safe way to do that and that it's a better way. Otherwise, why would we do it? You know, like an analogy I give is if I walk to the edge of a cliff and I see someone who is hanging on for dear life, and what they're hanging on to is like the root of a tree, and I can look over and I can see that every few minutes this root shifts, and it looks like it's just not going to hold very long. And it seems very obvious to me that the longer I stand here and the longer they hang on to this root, eventually they will fall to the depth. So I can lean over and say, you know, this is a very poor mechanism you have for saving yourself. It's not going to work. You can see it's not working. Why don't you let it go? And that would be a very crazy thing for me to suggest. And they would make a very wise decision to say, no, I'm going to keep hanging on to this failing root. But if I can tell them, hang on as long as you can, as much as you can, but you notice over here, just within your grasp, there's another root. And it looks like it's much stronger. And I'm not asking you to let go. I'm just asking you to reach and feel that root. And you can determine it. Does that feel like it does the same thing I'm trying to do? It's accomplishing the same purpose. And this one I can feel now is not such a good one to accomplish the same purpose. I don't have to tell the person to shift over there. They will do that. And so I look at that as really our goal as therapists, as healers, as peace builders, reconcilers, is to show a way that makes sense to the party that is trying to make a shift. And that's the best job we can do it. We create the frame. I always talk about creating a safe space, a space where someone within their own wisdom can see a better path. Because I absolutely believe that there's a strong inner core of goodness and wisdom that we all carry. It can be very distorted over times. It can be covered over like an onion over many years of sadness and disappointment and abuse and loss, to the point where to protect that, we've done all kinds of armor that's destructive around it. But I always work with the premise that this is there, and the idea is how can I just access that and partner with that part of a person and have them be my partner, rather than trying to tear away all the armor because I'm this wise healer and I can just sort of rip away the stab and then you'll heal much better. And if I was in her position, I would never come back again, so we proposed that. So what we did was we developed a model for us that allowed it to make sense to us when we talk to each other about what are you doing with this person. And so we looked at, and this isn't, I'm not proposing this as a universal model or one that has no questions or flaws. It doesn't need to be sort of more well thought out over time, but it really helped a great deal for our team to be able to communicate with each other about what we were doing and to communicate with a client. And some clients are able to do that. They can reach a point, like all I think are, they reach a point where dealing with concepts like this can make sense and are workable. You have to get to that point first, but you can introduce this later. And it's very important because once an understanding of what is happening is shared, then the power shifts. And the person becomes not just the learner, but they become a co-learner. And then they become, after a while, a teacher. And they begin to point out to the therapist where to go, how much to go, what makes sense, what they're willing to accept, what really fits their own personal experience in life that brought them to that point. So just very simply, I don't know if any of you have worked with communication theory before, but there's years and years ago, I used it actually started in graduate school. There was a model for communication, and it was called the awareness wheel. That was developed by Elam and Nunnally, I think. This is different, but that was something that we used a lot in just working with couples and families around communication dynamics. But we drew on the idea of looking at internal processes that someone else can't see. We only see the behaviors. We only know what comes out of someone. We don't know how they're taking in and then what's going on inside. And so we used that model of the awareness wheel to, we sort of distorted it in some sense. We changed it around. It really isn't following the same theory of the awareness wheel, but it uses some of the components. We sort of, like tore apart the machinery and put together something else. We identified 5 areas of awareness. One of them is sensing, and by this I mean our typical idea of sensing, what we hear, what we see, what touches us, what we smell, what we taste, our sixth sense of place and position. So this is our system as a human being. This represents our ears, our eyes, our tongues, our skin, and so on, where whatever happens in the outside world gets into our system. So that's always happening, whether you're awake or not. And it's happening before birth. This is an area of making sense of that. By sense, I mean adding meaning to that. So something happens. You can have 2 people in the same room. There can be an event, and they can each take a different meaning from that event. So how is that possible? And our idea was that something happens. I'm going to keep doing this apparently. Something happens in this area that changes how the person is viewing this and experiencing it. One person might view it very negatively. One person might be totally neutral. One person might actually take it as a positive event. And then from this point on, what happens is we take that meaning that we attach to whatever has come into our system and we compare it to what we need. What do we need from the world? Everything from like basic needs, if you think of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy, everything that we expect and need on a basic level, all the way to more, more higher level consciousness raising types of needs that we have to really fully experience our human experience. We compare the meaning to that. And then, however that compares, we have an emotional response to it. We feel something about that. And then what happens is there's, most of the time, these feelings are the primary energy that generates action. Now, action could be simply an expression. Or, you can sense a person tensing a little bit. Or the person themselves can sense their stomach tightening. Or their heart beginning to palpitating more. Or their breathing changing. But there's some physical kind of response that happens that goes out into the rest of the world. So this is an individual. And I'm sure other people who work with psychodynamics and other approaches that might say, well, there's another piece you're missing or whatever, but this made sense to us. We were talking earlier a few times about beliefs and a belief system. That's what made me decide to sort of throw this in as part of the talk. So if something happens in here, and this is an open system, there's nothing screening it, you're just completely open to the world, comes in, think of an infant that is not able to really screen very much at that point. Something comes into our sensing, we add meaning to it, we compare it to our needs, we have a feeling response to it, and then something happens that sort of expresses that whole process. This happens like this. It's not even something that we can feel sequentially happening unless we are really good at stopping and meditating and following as much of this as we can. And it's not impossible. I've done that myself, but it's very hard, and it's tiny pieces of our time that we can actually focus in that much of a way. But it allowed us to make sense and allowed people we work with after a while to sort of make sense of what was happening with them. This area here is very important, and the reason is, when we talk about beliefs, is that our idea is that is where beliefs are spawned. That's where beliefs form. It's a combination of whatever meaning we give to life events and how it compares to our needs. And after a while, we begin to expect something because of that. We can expect negative or positive, but we begin to expect. And expectations are based around what we believe about the world, our place in it, other people, how predictable life is, how predictable we are and other people. All of those things sort of come together around what happens here. This is probably this is the most static part of us after it begins to form, becomes embedded. It's the most protected part of us as well, and for good reason. When we're working with someone who, I mentioned before, cognitively can say, yes, I see what you mean, and I know I'm engaging in these self-destructive behaviors, and I just can't get a handle on not doing something that seems to diminish my life day to day. They're talking about the fact that I can't seem to think my way through this because my beliefs keep pulling the rug out from under me. My beliefs keep making me go in this direction, even though I'm trying to go in this direction, but at that point where I have to do something, I can't do that. It's like what I was talking about, not being able to make that leap into the water. I can't do it. Something stops me. And so we start by saying, we think it's a very good idea that you don't change this until you know why and you have a better option. I mean, one example of how a belief an expectation for a positive outcome of what we're looking for with our needs can become something that is a negative expectation and lead to believing negatively, not just about what is going to happen, but even about our own needs and about ourselves. Is we're all of us come into the world with an expectation of acceptance and nurturance. We come into the world really just sort of like an open system. We don't protect ourselves from anything other than having this wonderful nurturance coming into us for all of our needs. In fact, in the beginning, That's what we think the world is. We think we're the world. It takes us a while to begin to understand that, oh, this breast that feeds me, it's actually another entity. It's not like me. It's not like mine, because she leaves the womb, and I'm hungry. And I have to wait until this part of what was me comes back, just so I can not be hungry. And so when we talk about that idea, the idea of setting up and organizing our self-concept, in the beginning, our self-concept is the communal. And then we begin to narrow that down over time and realize that here's a not me, and here's a me. And eventually, there are more not me's that enter into our existence. We find out, there are other people who move around who are doing things. I can see them, they come, some touch me different ways, some sound differently, some smell differently. And so we're trying to make sense of this expanding universe that suddenly we're just a part of. It's like, when we thought that the Earth was the center of the universe, and we discovered, no, we're not. The sun doesn't go around us, we go around the sun. That was enough to try to deal with. Do you know that recently, there's been like a twofold increase in the number of planets that have been discovered in the universe? Just in the galaxy alone. And that's just the beginning. They're saying, well, we're expecting, as we get better with our optics, we're going to see many more. So our place continually gets, in a sense, smaller, and we have to make sense of what else is there just to make sense of. And I always like to say that we talk about this concept of the other. We used to do a series of conferences called Engaging the Other, the Power of Compassion. And the idea, it actually came out of a chapter I did for a book right after 9/11, and it was on psychological concepts of the other. And the idea was that the other is really a compass. It's not an entity, it's not you and you and you. It's a process. And it's a compass that we use to decide where we are and who we are in relation to everything else. In the beginning, the first other is the nurturer. The person who is closest to us, who first sort of divides from our consciousness, that's the first other. So our mother, our father, our siblings, our family is the first other. And then it expands out in more circles of people. And if we can sort of look at it that way and realize that, in a sense, we're creating the other every day that we move out into the world. We're determining who is more other, like you're more different than me somehow, and who isn't. And the ones who aren't so different become our frame of reference for belonging. Family, community, neighborhood, friends, ethnic group, nationality. We begin to determine what are the closest approximations of me and who accepts me into that approximation. And that's very powerful. That's one of the differences I'll talk about in terms of individual and communal experience of belief systems and of trauma. What we found is that when somebody would come into our service, they'd already done a lot of work in this area. This area had gotten to be very, very tailored. Very powerful and effective screens had come across this open space. So that if you have squares and circles and squares and circles, and after a while you're saying, these squares really cause me distress. When that happens, it really bothers me. And so do the circles. They really bother me when they come in, because some of them come in ways that support my needs and some come in ways that don't support my needs. And we try to figure out a way. If you think about, if you're inundated with something, even bright light, we begin to kind of go like this. We just try to limit what is coming into our system as a way of not being overwhelmed. Well, what can happen is, if somebody has this intense need for acceptance and love, and their early experience from their primary providers for their needs are negative, or even the opposite, if they're abused, for example, what do you think a young conscious begins to believe about the world? That basically, if you go like this, you're going to be hit in the stomach. And so it is healthier to try to constrict. It's not unhealthy. It's healthier to try to protect ourselves. And so, in a paradoxical way, we begin to expect, whenever we feel a need, we begin to expect that it will be denied or assaulted. And we do things that prevent any offering of nurturing of that need, because that's a threat. The system develops to protect ourselves. If somebody comes up to a castle during a siege and knocks on the door and says, I'm actually here to help you, and you open the door, no one is going to do this. That's going to be seen as too much of a threat. And so what happens is we begin to expect the worst in that area. We begin to prepare for it. And at some point, we may even begin to do the rejection to ourselves. You've ever seen like a toddler walking around, and they'll walk around and they'll touch things they're not supposed to touch. And someone says, no, 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 don't do that. And I don't know about here, but maybe in the United States in a previous generation, they might have their hands slapped. But they continue to touch because there's this drive. It's like, I want that. That's really, that's so shiny and bright and beautiful, and I just want to touch that. And every time they reach for that, they get punished. It could be slapped in the hand, it could be simply no in a very stern way. And that's something that happens that often is seen as sort of cute behavior, is at some point, it's not unusual to see a little toddler walk up to something, even if no one is around, begin to touch it and say, no, 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 and then they touch it. And the reason is they've already administered the punishment. They've already given themselves the denial, but not as bad as somebody else. So it's like, you don't need to harm me. You don't need to reject me. You don't need to tell me I'm worthless. I know that already. I've already done it. It's a protection so that I hit myself 20% of weight, so no one hits me with 100% of weight. Makes a lot of sense, right? Given no other options, it makes a lot of sense. That's how children who experience extreme abuse begin to move into a way of life that is self-destructive, not in an unhealthy way in terms of the motivation. The behavior is unhealthy, but not the motivation. The motivation is salvation and protecting whatever they believe is their most vulnerable and good part and deserving part. I don't deserve to be hit 100%. So I'll hit myself 20% as a way of protecting and even affirming my worth. And if that kind of understanding is kept when you're working with someone, it's amazing how quickly someone can become your partner. Because too often, what's assumed is that you just got off on a bad track. I'm not sure why you're doing this, but you need to look at this chart. I have a chart here, but look at this chart and see your self-defeating behaviors. And here's where you can, a decision point. When you're here, you need to just do this instead of this. And someone can even agree. They can leave the office. They can say, I'm going to do that from now on. And the next time you see them, you can hear that, well, I just couldn't do it. Or it didn't work. That doesn't work in life. Maybe it works for you. It doesn't work for me. I'm in a unique situation. And actually they are. They are in a unique situation because this inner world is so personal and idiosyncratic and very diverse. The cliche phrase, no one of us is like another, is absolutely true. Because in our inner dynamics, when we dream, it's limitless. So this is limitless also. What we take in and what we do with it is very varied. Now what can happen though is that when this process is going, it sort of goes like this. There's an arrow here, there's an arrow here, arrow here, arrow here, arrow here. So it's this process like this. This is an individual person. And I drew this over here because this is another individual person. We use this a lot with couples counseling, where someone would say, I just don't understand what's going on with them. I don't understand why they're acting this way toward me. And the other person can parrot the same phrase. Because all they're looking at is this. And they have no idea. Not only do they not have an idea about this, they don't have an idea of what they had done and said, how it was coming into that person's awareness. Because when this screen gets to be very tight, after a while, we begin to believe that's the way the world is. We no longer see ourselves as screening. We say, look, that's what happens. Every time, if I set up like in this case, it would be a screen that only allowed circles. Or maybe once in a while, it'll allow a square. So we'll say, the only thing that comes in here are all these negative circles. And maybe once in a while, by accident almost, you'll get a square that comes in. But mostly the world, when I'm out there, you should walk the street with me. Mostly what happens to me is negative. There could be a lot of squares out there that are completely negated and denied and ignored. Partly because we're so invested in looking for this, we're looking for the needle in the haystack, which is the threat. And so we find it in many ways. The other part is that if there is something out there that sort of looks on face value as a square that's coming in to our system here, we're going to say, well, this is not something that I want to come into my system because it threatens my protection. It actually puts me in a vulnerable position where I feel out of balance. I took a lot of time to arrange this. This gets me through day to day. And you're knocking on the door and asking me to unravel it, and you offer nothing else in place that I can see as even equal to that, let alone better. So when you have this going on an individual basis, a traumatic experience occurs, we add meaning to it. We say, what does it mean? Whether it's to us as an individual or vicariously if we watch it happen to someone else. We tell ourselves what it means. We compare it to our needs. We have an emotional response, and then we act. When it engages with our beliefs, these things can become embedded. Just like the abused child embeds a negative belief, we can embed those kinds of meanings that we come to in terms of what has happened to us from the outside world. And when you have two people even, I have to do this sort of upside down, or maybe like this. You have this, and then you have this. So actions into here. This person is thinking they're very clear on what they're doing and saying. They have no idea what this person is taking in and making sense of, and then reacting to. So on an individual basis, it's complicated enough. On a two-person basis, it more than doubles the complication. But can you imagine millions of this? So that's one of the commonalities is that the similar things can happen in a group, but it's much more complicated. And when it happens in the group, a difference is that all of these people can often support each other in forming a similar negative belief. If you're working with an individual, you can you create a relationship and you're working on how to allow other options to seep in. And it always has to seep in. If you try to inundate someone with new facts that contradict this, what can happen is they'll just get rid of this square completely. They'll just shut down. They won't let anything in. It's like using force against a force field. You actually generate more of the resistance. And the real trick is to allow cracks in the door. Just to allow 5% of doubt of the belief. Because 5% of the doubt doesn't activate the defense. It doesn't activate the stronger shield. It's like, well, 95% of my belief can certainly handle that. That's an aberration, and I'll accept it. That's a rare incident, I'll accept that. It's not something to count on. It's not something that I certainly will change my life because of, but I'll accept the reality of it, that it exists. And you have hardly any threat feeling about that because you're very well settled into that belief system. Little by little, it's like drop by drop, small amounts of contradictory facts come in that contradicts the negative belief system. And after a while, something really wonderful happens. You begin to feel internal dissonance. You begin to feel like, I just can't 100% believe that anymore. But I believe it mostly. And little by little, that cognitive dissonance, that emotional dissonance, that belief dissonance, that's the gateway to change. And it's very important, whether we're peace builders or therapists, to not speed up at that point. And I know it can be hard to say that, especially if you look in a situation where you feel like we need things to happen faster here. Often in this kind of a process, faster can shut the system down. So we've talked about dialogue groups in many parts of the world. We've talked about, yesterday we talked about various approaches to creating the space where reconciliation can happen. We even talked about the fact that it's very important that the reconciliation is willing and feels natural, that it's not forced. You're not required to do it. It's the same philosophy. It's creating that kind of space to where you let a little something come in that challenges a negative belief, in that case, about an entire group of people. They're the enemy, they're the evil ones. They're not trustworthy. They're almost not human. They're like a different subset, because look how terrible they are. And we need to let a little bit of dissonance come in that is like the open door to once again coming into balance with people that we share this planet with. Not in a way that's tacit, not in a way that we say, okay, so that we stop shooting, I'll just agree, you exist. Because that's short-lived, we've seen that. It just takes another spark later on that just taps into that negative energy, that unhealed energy of wounds that are unattended to, and violence erupts at that point. So, I don't mean to say that it's too complicated, but I mean to say that we have to honor the complication of that. And in our discussions here, I think I picked up on some of the frustrations, like mentioning that, well, can you just always consider reconciliation? Can you always just recommend that we do a dialogue group to open up and listen, just listen to the stories of the other side? And I think that comes from the fact that I don't see it working fast enough, or I don't see it working in every situation, or I don't see it working enough. And that may come from just our wish that that was not the case, that it could work faster, it could work in every situation, no matter what, at the same speed, at the same quantity, and the same quality. But we have to I think we have to be patient in that sense. Very similar to being patient with someone you're working with individually and dealing with very painful experiences that have developed very powerful defenses, that even they can say, I don't like that belief, I wish I didn't have it. It's not that I want that belief, but that is my belief. I don't want to believe that I'm going to die, but I do believe I'm going to die. And so that's the dilemma often that we're in. And if we can partner with the wish that says, there's a healthy part of me that keeps wanting things to be better. I don't want to wake up every morning hating. I don't want to wake up every morning feeling threatened or feeling that, there's unattended to retribution. I don't want to wake up every morning and steaming or being painful or crying because of the losses that I'm aware of every time I think about my life. I don't want this, but that is life. That's my belief about life. So this is about needs. And as I said, we developed it, I didn't even look at any of my notes yet. We developed it, first of all, as I said, to help us make sense of working with folks. But we used that kind of perspective when we're working with groups also. And so far, what we found is if we stay true to that, and we really try to come from our own genuine place, and we don't try to impose our sort of know-it-all selves to people, but always come in expecting that you really have the final answer, and I'm just a facilitator. And at some point, I can be a partner, and at some point, you will guide me. I won't be guiding you. That allows me as a person to go into some very dark and painful places with people. Because I believe I'm not going into like a black hole. I believe I'm going through something, into something where I can actually be with someone at that beginning point, when this was beginning, and simply be able to point out to that adult at that point that, it ain't necessarily so anymore. And actually, the adult the big person, the giant of the world who was not there for you to protect you, who was not there to sort of help you form a more positive belief system, you're that person now. You can be that for yourself. But you have to get to that place first where it began. You have to be there to, in a sense, console, teach, guide, care for yourself. And that's where the rebuilding happens. That's the rebuilding process that comes out of that. That takes time. When we're working with many, many people, it not only takes time, but you have the entire process of, do I want to belong to this group and pay the price by adopting their belief system or not? On a theoretical basis, we can say, well, no, I want to adopt a negative belief system. But when it's our family and our community, and when it's our sense of communal self, it's very difficult to walk away from that. Even if we just don't necessarily verbalize our dissonance, it's very difficult not to sort of stay in that community. And when somebody is going through this process of very difficult change, if you have multitudes of people all around them saying, don't change, this is true, this is the way things are, it just complicates it even more so. That's a difference between the individual experience and the group experience. And so when we're looking at some of the ways, I'll just jump to real quickly, some of the ways that societies and communities and families can perpetuate negative beliefs and perpetuate negative images, enemy images, demonic images of the other. We have to look at more than psychology, more than mental health. We have to look at like our system of how we are together. It's very interdisciplinary, it requires that. Everyone really needs to be at the table, because it's not just, I talked about more like a therapeutic process here. We have to look at our educational system. We have to look at our architecture, our anthropology, our sociology. We have to look at how we form our arts. If you want to find some of the deep-seated negative belief systems that carry with it victim identity for an entire community, take a look around at the monuments in any society. Take a look at the folklore and the folk songs and the art. And see if you can find anything in that that has any semblance of loss and victimhood, of protection from the outside, of being attacked. There are monuments to obvious victimhood. There are also monuments to victory, which is just the flip side. We were victorious in stopping someone from victimizing us. So it's just the flip side of the same energy. How many, I'll use the example in the United States. It's always good to start with yourself, because when we get too much into discussions about victim identities and how they're created and developed and sustained and passed on, we teach our children who were never involved in an incident to feel as if they were involved in it. And then they teach their children the same thing. It's like passing this bucket of toxicity down the line to our children and grandchildren and next generations on, and just continuously. But if we can look at, and this is not a fast process either, if we can look at how we perpetuate within our societies, it helps us at least say, the next time we're going to do that thing, let's think it through a little more and think, what do we really want the message to be next generation? In the United States, there are many monuments to war and tragedy, and I point to, not just that, but there are many that are in that category. And I point to things like Pearl Harbor. People are familiar with in World War II, the base in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor was bombed, and it was a devastating attack. There's a memorial now at Pearl Harbor if you go there. Many of the ships were left where they were sunk, so they became this memorial. There's a ship that still contains many bodies of the sailors that were there. That's part of the memorial. The bodies are still there. No matter how good you feel about your American ethos, your American culture, and your identity, no one can go to that and feel good. If you take a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old and they're saying, what is this and what happened? Why are we here? And you explain what that really is, you cannot expect them to see that as a highlight of their vacation. You know, I've seen people go into these memorials and carrying little children to very sad and depressing and terrifying sometimes memorials. Because the thinking is, this is part of your cult, this is part of your history, you need to know about this. This is part of you if you want to belong to us. And I think that's destructive. As therapists, I understand the reason for the memorials. It's grieving, it's remembrance. There's nothing wrong with remembrance. Grieving is an essential process when there is such loss, no matter if it's individual or community. It's an essential piece of what has to happen. As a therapist, if I'm working with someone, or if I have a friend, and they've experienced the loss of a dear loved one, I expect that they'll grieve. In fact, if I don't see them, I might spend some time with them just to help them feel comfortable and okay with the grieving process. Because I know what will happen if they skip that process. It's an essential human process to go through. Animals go through it. It's just part of our biology. But if a year later, or 2 years later, or 10 years later, I come upon my friend and they're still mourning, they're still wearing black, they're still not going to work, or they're still not expecting good things in life, they're still not recovering from that, and every day is the remembrance of a terrible loss, and that's what they carry with them. I would look at that as unhealthy. I think that's probably a common perception of that situation. This isn't good. You need to come back into life. You need to come back into balance. Not only within yourself, but with the world around you. You need to begin to expect that you're not going to lose every time you turn around. And so we would want that person to not continually grieve. But when we look at ourselves on a societal level, it's like we lose that whole message. We have memorials that tell us every day, you're not done grieving. Feel like it happened yesterday. And there's no end. It's not like go through this and you'll feel better. You get to resolution, you get to a point where you can remember the good things. You can go to a cemetery and say, yes, I'm sad that my mother died, but I remember such wonderful times with her. That's where we want to get. As a society, it's very difficult to get there when you have these memorials. And they just developed a memorial for 9/11 in the United States. I can't tell you how many people I know who went there almost naively thinking, I'm going to go to the site because I'm in New York, I'm going to see the site. And afterwards they talked about how bad they felt. And how even if they considered themselves very open-minded and liberal, they said, I just couldn't avoid these images of these terrible, evil Arabs who did this to us. If you go to Pearl Harbor, it's very difficult for someone to walk away and not have some negative image about Japanese. It's something that, if you go to the concentration camp memorial, it's very difficult to go there and then to have some sense of, I'm in Germany, it's a beautiful country, I like this place. It's very difficult. Because these things tell us, don't look at this as reality. Don't look at anything like this. That is factual. Look at this. And it doesn't matter if it was 3 generations ago. That's what you pay attention to. We have memorials that are the opposite. In the United States, the one that I like to point to, I'm sort of on the bright side, now that I've depressed everybody. But on the bright side is that's an iconic image that represents the ethos of America that it's just in recent centuries, last 2, 1.5 maybe, is the Statue of Liberty. Completely different energy. It's open. It's accepting. It says, give me your tired, give me your poor. This is a place you can come. You can be different. Everyone, your tired masses, you could be feeling that you're living at the lowest level of life. You're welcome here. It's very much appreciating and actually giving you a sense of love for diversity, for the human condition, the human community. Completely different feeling. That's the kind of icon that I would want to pass on to my grandchildren. Not Pearl Harbor. But if I went into the United States now, when I'm in international settings, I always lead with, my background is as an Arab American Muslim psychologist, so I've got several of those identities going for me. But in the United States, when I'm in international settings, I lead with the cultural icons in the United States because even though I see head shaking here, it can be easy to see it from the outside when you're looking at someone else's experience. if someone then turns to you and says, now look at your communal identity, and let's look at where this happens in your identity, it's very difficult. We can begin to say things like, no, I understand the concept, but it's kind of different with us, you know, or it's a unique situation with us, and so you have to like turn it a little bit because it doesn't fit that. And that's just human, because we're talking about who we are. It's like if somebody went up to you, oh, it's Nancy, who said, someone walks up to you and you're lost, and they say, can I give you some feedback? You know? It sounds kind of nice. If I was sitting there and somebody walked up and said that, they would, well, why are you just tensing up because of that? You know? But if someone turned to me and said, Steve, can I just give you some feedback? It's like, ooh, like something else is happening here. So we need each other. We need each other to help us point out our blind spots. We really cannot do it alone. I don't care if we're an individual or an ethnic group or a country, a religion, you know, whatever the characteristics you put into like who you are, all the trappings and so on. We can't do it alone because as human beings, we are myopic when it comes to these kinds of things. And this is anthropological. It's not even like it just happened recently and we'll figure it out from where even history was recorded and began. This is anthropological. I don't know of any group or society, and I'm not saying they don't exist, I don't know of any group or society that ever put up its hand and said, yeah, we were the perpetrators and we really had no good reason. We just did it. It doesn't matter. You could look at Rome. Rome was about we're creating the system we're bringing the system to the world to order. But if you're on the receiving end, it doesn't feel like that. It feels like destruction. And so we need each other to gently, with compassion. Wow, I use all the time. I knew it was happening. When I start talking, sometimes I have to. That's why I usually carry a watch, which I don't have with me right now. But thank you for 10 minutes because I need to wrap up within that 10 minutes. So when we have a conference like this, one of the great things is when someone comes from not just different places and different experiences, but different thoughts and opinions. I think when we get into a discussion and everyone in the room just sort of nods their heads and never contests anything or never says, well, it's not quite clear enough to me, or, you know, this seems like it doesn't fit all the situations I'm aware of. When that doesn't happen, it feels like we're not really growing. And we need someone. I don't mean in a contesting way all the time where it's always saying no to something. I just mean, you know, can you give me a little more clarification? You know, can we think about this to how would this fit? Because it makes us always revisit, just like we're asking people to revisit negative belief system. It's revisiting our worldview. And it's reminding us, oh, you know, I really am not like, my eyes don't go all around my head. My eyes are really here. And there's a lot happening here, there's a lot happening here, there's a lot happening here that I'm just clueless about. But someone else is seeing that, and thank God, because they're going to share that with me. They're going to give me that information. So if we look at ourselves as not trying to find out who the bad one is, who caused it, who was the culprit, who's at fault, because that nobody partners with you. I mean, if somebody came to me and said, Steve, can you help me figure out how you're the fault? I mean, even if I smiled, I really wouldn't help them. I mean, why would I do that? That means that I believe that my inner sense is not good, that I'm not a good person, that I'm sort of like part of what has to be eradicated from the human community. I know this is a very touchy, I wasn't going to mention it, but I think it's maybe a good appropriate example here. And this is viewing from the outside. I'm just letting you know that I don't live in the Balkans. I'm not a well-versed historian that has a lot of information about the Balkans. But this is something that made sense to me, and that was part of my learning curve. A number of years ago, it was at the end, the Balkan War was still going on, but it was near the end. We brought a number of people from the Balkans to our international conference on conflict transformation in Russia, in St. Petersburg, because it was a neutral ground. And these people could not meet each other in the region. They just, even if they were within a stone's throw, they just could not meet each other. And they were part of the choir. They came to our conference because it was a peace conference. And we were thinking we'll bring people together and we'll just sort of have have a panel on how do you just begin to prepare the ground to then lay the seeds of peace. And as we're having this discussion, I realized after a while that we really had a lot of preconceived ideas about what was going on and what would happen or what could happen in our conference. And one of the things I learned a great deal about, for me, came from one of the Serbians who came to the conference. Somebody who was very oriented and very committed to the peace process, very much against the genocidal activities and behaviors of the armies. And yet, as this was in some of our private discussions, actually private discussions that eventually included everyone else from the Balkans, because originally people just sort of sat on opposite sides of the room. But what I learned was just a bit about Serbian perspective of history. The idea of well, we're not doing this for nothing. There's a reason why we're doing this. And even almost in an apologetic way, what I was told by this friend was, what is happening now is not right. It's wrong. I'm against it. But people forget what happened to us. They forget that generations before, in 2 battles with the Ottomans, we lost the majority of our young men. They were just devastated on the fields of Kosovo. And for us, the fields of Kosovo carry up like this deep meaning, other than just political in a sense. And the thing he added was, so when we hear the criticism, I understand the criticism. I agree with this criticism, but it's painful when I hear it from our Christian brothers and sisters in Europe. Because the narrative that he shared with me was that the Serbs stood as a human wall that stopped the Muslim invaders from overwhelming Europe. And so they saw themselves as heroic martyrs that paid the highest price. And it's and our Christian brothers and sisters forgot that. And the other part was, he didn't agree with it, but he said, what I hear a lot when I'm in my country is, all we're trying to do is get rid of the descendants of the invaders. So it's a distorted picture of the facts of the situation, but it's a window into that victim mentality, that justification of, we're really not bad people. I go home, I have my family, I wake up in the morning, I try to feel like I'm a good person. And I'm not talking about situations where someone's moral compass is use the term sociopathic, for example. I'm not talking about situations, although I think much of that is where just a much more galvanized system that just didn't allow that to develop. But it's an example of where something that you can look at as atrocious behavior, inhumane behavior toward others, can somehow make sense to a good sense of ourselves. And it's not only in that situation. I mean, if you look throughout history, there are many situations where if you were on the other side of the action, you would call it a crime against humanity. But on this side, it's called collateral damage, because they were the wrong ones and we were the good ones. And in war, stuff happens. And yes, we bombed Dresden. We bombed Hiroshima. But we had to do that. Because if we didn't do it, look what would have happened. And look how many more lives would have been lost. But if you're on the receiving end of that, it's pretty hard to see the justification for that. And that's what we need to do. We need to realize that we need to be on both sides of a situation to say that we understand it. And we also need to look at how we can fool ourselves into being and doing things to other people that are against our whole concept of being a good person. When that happens, what I have seen just consistently, if someone can own that and say, I cannot justify that, I sort of on another seeing eye level, I see what I'm doing, you don't need to tell that person not to do it anymore. In the huge majority of cases, I haven't seen it in my own life not happen yet. The person is invested in changing because no one wants to consider themselves a bad person. No one wants to say, I'm even if they tell themselves that as a way of stopping someone else from continually telling themselves, that's just a peripheral defense mechanism. No one truly believes, I'm really kind of a bad, degenerate person. That's who I am. I've heard people who do things and they justify it by saying there are two kinds of people in the world. There are perpetrators and there are suckers. And I knew what it was like to be a sucker, and I'm not going to be a sucker. So the only choice is, the healthier choice for me, I'm going to be a perpetrator. That's a belief system that gives a person two choices. But if they were able to see a third choice, believe in a third choice, their internal process would push them in that direction. Nobody needs to. And that's just my own personal philosophical belief about us as human beings. And so far, it's allowed me to keep doing this work and be in very, very painful kind of situations along the way. So if anyone here is involved with what your societies do to remember, writing history books and telling the story, we talked about how if you go to Serbia, you read a history book, it's quite different about the Balkan War. And who was it that was saying that they encountered a high school student who told them a story about why the last Balkan Wars began? It was just, I mean, it was a shock to her when she heard it. And she said, where did you hear this? And I said, well, my professor told me this. That's what they tell us in school. And it sounds like somebody who didn't have an agenda themselves, but they said, that's just the way it is. We were taught that. Isn't that the way it was? And they're going to grow up feeling good about themselves and having this image that might then later at some time allow them to feel justified if their society does something to another society. You know, I had to come to terms with that myself. When I was growing up, for example, if I read in the history books about the Native Americans in the United States, if I saw a movie, if I read a book, it was always that they were savages, that it was better to like compress them into spaces to try to almost like imprison them into little concentration groups that they call reservations. No, even though on one level I sort of knew they were here before us, it didn't hit me until I was able to, in a sense, conceive of various other options when I was literally like in, 8th or 9th grade. That it began to hit. And then you know what happened? A very sort of cultural pop thing happened. Little Big Man came out. This pop movie. I can't tell you how many people went to that movie and came back sort of shocked. Because it was a movie about what I'm talking about the experience of the Native Americans. And it was almost like, you know, I just never thought about it. And once you really get into it, you realize, well, of course, I mean, these people lived here, we came here, and we took over the land, and they resisted. It kind of makes sense, you know. So anyway, that's just another example of looking at our cultural icons, our cultural stories, our personal stories, and allowing, like in a compassionate way, allowing ourselves to be questioning that a bit, and inviting in other people who come to us with compassion and come to us with care to help us see past our blind spots.